And we're live. Welcome to Don't Be Coy. I'm your host, Uncle Lew, and today I have the honor, pleasure, and the utmost appreciation to have with me today Miss Samara Jinks-Chang. Samara, thanks for being on the show. How are you doing this morning?
I am lovely. How about yourself?
I'm doing pretty good. Can't complain. How's your previous week been? Any kind of takeaways?
It's been a very full week. I've had a graduation for one of my siblings, a medical conference in San Diego. So there's been a lot of sky mounts this past week.
I feel that. Well, for the people at home, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. I think the one-liner, which is a term we use in medicine to kind of summarize a patient, is I'm a physician, a pediatrician at Seattle Children's Hospital. I'm a chief resident. I'm also a oldest sister of 10, a daughter, granddaughter, and just, a woman of faith. So that's kind of the one-liner.
All right, I appreciate that. So I do kind of really want to talk to you a little bit around your journey in medicine and like how that has come into fruition. So like, can you tell us a little bit around like your journey around how you first got interested in medicine and like how you came to be about a chief resident?
Absolutely. So I always say that if you want to understand me, all you have to understand is Barbara and Richard. So Barbara, Dale Jinks, and Walter Richard Jinks were my grandparents. My grandfather passed away. My grandmother is very much still here, still very feisty. And they are really the reason that I'm here. And so I was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, Zone 4, Southwest Atlanta, for those that means something too. And so I, was born at Grady Hospital. And from the day that I was born, they took me to 2120 Highview Road, which is, like our family's home, which has come to take on a new meaning now that there's so much gentrification and we're all getting calls about it. But that's our home and it always will be. And so that is like, those two people are really, I say they're the reason I'm here. I think the larger village obviously played a role, but my grandmother was a school teacher in Atlanta Public Schools for over 25 years. And then my grandfather was a public health worker. So he worked at the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, as well as the Georgia Public Health Department. So I really grew up around like just civil servants, people who had that in mind to serve both in their careers and then also just in the family unit. So on my mother's side, I have 5 siblings, and on my father's side, I have 4. And at least for, the first 10 years of my life, my grandparents were, what we would call in medicine kinship caregivers. We don't really use the word adoption in Black families. We just say, oh, my grandmother took care of me. My grandfather took care of me. That's just kind of how we function. And it's not until later that you sort of realize that extended family unit that just covers you, whether it's, not just, in terms of the house over your head, but, spiritually praying for you, making sure that you have all of your needs met, is unique in some ways. Not so much in our community. I feel like half the people in my neighborhood were raised by their grandparents, just because we grew up, during the height of the crack cocaine epidemic. And so it became normalized for me until probably I was about 13. I got recruited to this preparatory school on the other side of town called the Westminster Schools. And that was a game changer, just because I kind of felt like a stranger, like in my own city. It was just completely different. Atlanta has changed a lot over the years, but at least during my childhood, it was pretty segregated. And so it was definitely a situation where, I never really saw people that weren't Black on a regular basis. I kind of joked that I saw them on TV. And then, in real life, it was just all Black everything. My mayor was Black, teachers, doctors, which is the flip side of it. And that I always had role models. I live right next to the AUC. So Morehouse, Spelman, Clark, Morris Brown, those were my world. And my church, Ebenezer Baptist Church, which is, Martin Luther King's home church. So it was definitely one of those situations where I had on paper, you would look at the story and you would say, oh, there's been so much overcoming. And in my world, like I had everything I ever needed. because I never wanted for anything. As a matter of fact, I joke that I grew up at the Morehouse School of Medicine because every summer I was the nerd in science camp. Um, Basically because they got tired of me doing little experiments around the house. Because my great grandmother, I had lied once and told her had to do an experiment. So I was like, I had moldy bread like in a jar, like underneath in the cabinet in her kitchen, and I was just trying to see what happened because I heard that things will mold if you did that. And then I had another jar where I had the jar open, and she was like, "What does this project do?" Come to find out, they were like, there was no project. She just wanted to experiment. And that would happen all the time. Like outside the Waffle House, I would have ice and like have salt on one piece of ice and another, without it. And they were just like, we needed to get her in some type of program. And so the AUC, which is the largest consortium of historically Black colleges and universities in the United States, it becomes this, intellectual haven for like Black intelligentsia, and they had science camp. And so at the time it was called Ben Carson. They've since renamed it. But the Ben Carson Summer Science Academy was the beginning. And then we went to the Vivian Thomas Summer Research Program. And so, that was my world. And then, at 13, one of those moms from that program, Miss Ivy, her daughter was in a program at Westminster. And so that prep school was, completely foreign to me. But we put in an application, and, every step along the way, I've always had people looking out for me. Even at Morehouse School of Medicine, Dr. Allwood, who ran the program, he always just tells the story of how my grandmother walked in and he said, "How much do you have to pay for this?" And she said, "I got a $5 bill in my pocket." And she was like, "Okay." And that $5 paid for 10 years of science camp. Similarly, that was one blessing. That then at that program, I meet Miss Ivy, who, had no reason to kind of, go out of her way for me, but she also told everyone she needs to be in a school that can really, take her to the next level. And I'm still, thriving. Like I loved all my Black teachers, Dr. Harris, Miss Tanya Starr. Like I just had a lot of support. And so it was, for me, I didn't know the difference. I mean, my 8th grade science teacher, we actually rode in my grandmother's Cadillac to the state science fair together. And so it was just like a little adventure because my teachers were an extension of my family. And then I get to Westminster and I always joke, I tell people one of the first things that I knew that this place was different was because people used to leave their backpacks everywhere. And I would be like, "Oh, you left your backpack. Your stuff is going to get jacked." And they were like, "Oh, people don't steal here." Like it was just like a very different environment. There was no fights. People just left their stuff everywhere. I mean, this is a huge campus. It's bigger than a lot of colleges, actually. And this school, a lot of the '96 Olympics track and field equipment was, there. Like the Olympic teams, like practiced in their pool. So it was just like a land of plenty. And there was a small Black community, but it felt like I had been, basically taken on a rocket ship to space. And then to add another layer to it, the guy that beat me in the state science fair, he also got recruited there the same year. I think we ended up winning together, but I was like, "Bill, really? He's here?" So yeah, most of the kids there were there for scholarships, not for scholarships, but most of the kids were there for athletics when they came in as a 9th grader. But I was just like the state science fair kid who had a really, different story than most of the kids there. And from the beginning, they didn't want me to take honors classes, and I was like, "Oh no, I'm a strong student. I really like science," but they couldn't fathom that, a public school kid, would be able to. And I was just like, "I just won the state science fair." Like, what do you mean I can't take honor science classes? And so my grandmother wasn't playing that. And so we ended up, getting into the honors physics classes. And, it was a struggle just because a lot of these kids, even though I've been at science camp every summer and all of those things, like we just didn't have the resources. So I remember I took geometry twice because I had placed out of it and there wasn't the resources to send me to the high school up the road as an 8th grader. So when you're in Atlanta public schools, you just do it again.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, and then I ended up going there. And so from Westminster, I ended up getting a Gates scholarship, and then that funded Georgetown, where I went to undergrad. And that was a huge jump as well, because I was president of Black Student Alliance. I kind of came into my own at that point, because I'd been a little sheltered, I'll say, just having grown up with my grandparents. And then, there was also the added, I forgot to mention, so my mother got clean around the age of 10. And so I had that new, dynamic to work out as well. And then I was just on my own. And so I had a little growing pains first year, because I went out as much as I possibly could, because grandma wasn't watching anymore. And just, let's just say it was a transition. And then, from there, it was a matter of kind of deciding on, majors. And, you would think that science would have been automatic. But the other thing that prep school did for me is they sent me to Europe for a year, which is, again, like, none of my life has been, a direct linear path. It's been very circuitous. And, that year in Europe is actually why I ended up at Georgetown, because I joined the school for some foreign service. I had studied Italian and, both like Roman architecture and Greek. I studied Latin, got back, and I was like, I want to travel the world, because my world had opened up so much, both just across town, from Southwest Atlanta to, Buckhead, where my prep school was, and then getting to go to Europe and learn a new language and have a radio show in Italy. I was like, I want to do this for a profession. And so started it in diplomacy school, effectively. And then I ended up coming back right to where I always knew I should have been, which was science. And so that happened, I think I had gone to Ethiopia for like a teaching job just over the summer, trying to do my, international affairs exploration. And I saw a lot of kids there that were malnourished. And so it was really hard. It's like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, to say, oh, I'm going to focus on teaching you English when, you can barely stay, awake in my class because you haven't eaten. And so it was very eye-opening. And I mean, even going back to the US, I couldn't even go in a grocery store for a while, just because it was such a stark contrast. And I, decided probably after Ethiopia that I was going to go back to medical school. And that meant, getting a lot of courses in and ultimately applying to medical school. Everybody was very confused, because I had worked for the government, during college for a couple of years, expecting to do a civil service job. And they would say, well, how did you end up in medicine? And the answer was, well, I trained to be a diplomat, and I'm still going to be a diplomat, just between patients and families and the medical system, because all those skills are very, very transferable. And I genuinely would go into the story a little bit less or a little bit more, depending on who I was looking at in front of me during a med school interview. And so, Duke was where I went to medical school, and then I did a master's at Harvard in public health. So again, definitely not linear in any way, shape, or form. And then the biggest swing was probably Seattle, because I matched out here after medical school. And, it was definitely like, it almost felt like going back to Europe. I joke that I'm on study abroad, because Atlanta and Seattle could not be more opposite in a lot of ways culturally. But they've really embraced me in my career. And so I ended up being selected as a chief resident, which means, if you don't watch a lot of Grey's Anatomy, that I do a lot of teaching and schedules and administrative work for all of the new doctors that are training to be pediatricians. And I'm only 1 year removed from that 3 years of training. But again, every step of the way, I can think of all the people that have kind of punctuated key decisions and times in my life. And I've always had people advocating on my behalf, to the point where, it doesn't make any sense. So I, go out of my way to make sure that everybody has what they need, because I've been an eldest sibling, my entire life. So I kind of feel like I'm the eldest sibling of, 140 doctors in training. And it's kind of come full circle from that, kid who was doing little science projects that weren't actually projects assigned by anyone, to, taking care of patients and families, and a lot of kids that are in similar situations that I was in. And so it's just been a blessing, which is probably more detailed than you wanted, but it's hard to kind of sum up all of the various factors without kind of giving do credit to everyone along the way.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I really appreciate you sharing all that, because one thing that really stuck out for me was like this this aspect in your life where, you at a very young age were not necessarily plucked away from like your community, but like removed from like your comfort zone, where you had your grandmother, your grandfather, you had like the support network with the colleges in the area that kind of knew your family, and moved to this kind of I'm assuming uh like you said, it was like on the other side of town in Buckhead, where everything was like stark different. Like you could people just laid their backpack down, and it was like, whoa, this is okay. You can just leave your backpack here. Yeah, it's perfectly fine. But like from there, it kind of created this kind of pattern where you were traveling to all of these different places, like not only within that high school, going to Europe, but then going to Washington, D.C., going to North Carolina, going to Boston, now being in Seattle. Like, I'm curious around what those experiences were like for you. And like, when you from the beginning had such a very strong network of a support system, how did you go about making sure that that support system was still there, or building new ones in the various places that you were at?
So it's interesting you framed it that way. I don't know. I mean, I come from a generation of storytellers, so it's hard for me not to make friends no matter where I go.
Mm.
My aunt, who is in California, is probably the closest relative to me, like both physically and just in terms of our dynamic, because I talk to her every other day. She always says, you don't know a stranger. And I was like, I surely don't, and neither do you. Where did I get it from? Because that's just kind of how we move in the world. And a lot of that had to do with Westminster and learning how to code switch, very young, at the age of 13. And then, I don't think that's a unique experience for Black people, especially folks that are going, pursuing higher education. You learn how to navigate uncomfortable spaces until they become comfortable.
Yeah.
Which is why, that word resilience, it has like a double-edged sword now. Because you can, people like Black people are resilient because they have to be, not because they want to be, necessarily. And I think that necessity kind of just breeds like the type of personality that says like, I'm going to be able to, hustle my way through just about anything. And so I think of that being one aspect of it. Like they always told me that, you're never going to be in an environment where, God and your family are not at your back. Like even if they're not physically with you. Italy also reinforced that, because I didn't speak the language. And, by the end of it, like the family that I stayed with, the Vanessa family, like they made me one of theirs too. And I still, all of my, play godchildren are there, and we still go back to visit. So I think that comes from Barbara and Richard. Like they can navigate just about any situation. And I think that is a skill that's very common, like in our community, if you're going to make it, because you can't always be comfortable, because the world wasn't designed for us. This country wasn't built for us. And so I kind of take that mentality into most situations, and nobody else really would look at me and even tell. The other aspect of the story I haven't mentioned is that I'm actually mixed race. My father's Pakistani, but it's, the story of how that happened, that would need a whole nother podcast. We don't have time to go into all that. But it's how I do credit the way that I moved through the world to, my village, so to speak. And every step along the way, that village has expanded. And we stay in, pretty constant communication. So, everybody at my chief's office knows what's going on in my family, because it is very much still a part of who I am, on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. One thing that you got me thinking about there is like when you spoke about resilience and code switching, like the tenacity of it all. And like, by you being like a trained physician and gone through your residency and then being a chief resident, like you have this kind of resilience to the point of, how to endure the pressures of, going through your step exams, going through your clinicals, going through all these different things that, you know, put a lot of pressure onto you, so that, as my father would say, it takes, to cook meat, you need that hot fire. And so your water
Mm-hmm.
needs to boil. And so, like, the, I guess you could say, the right temperatures for yourself to, like, get yourself to cook that meat and, like, start boiling over that water, but also know whenever to take the pot off so that it can simmer down, and, like, all those different kind of things. But, like, what's really interesting to me is, like, and I'm kind of curious about this, is like, how do you, as an individual, know whenever, like, you're putting too much pressure on yourself from doing all the code switching for the X amount of years, the resilience that it took for not only medical school, but also moving to these various different locations? Because, like, similar to you, like, I'm familiar with, like, the DC area, the Northeast, the Pacific Northwest, and, like, they're all different areas than it is the Southeast, especially, like, Atlanta. So, like, how, as an individual, do you get back to your centering so that you can go into every single day with your best foot forward?
There's a couple of ways to think about this. Part of it is reframing, which, again, this is a coping mechanism. It's not something that, I would have hoped I have to do, but I always think about the people that didn't make it. So when I walk into a space, I know that there's somebody who didn't make it into that space. And so for me, I think of every day that I have in this role, as a physician, kind of just as a gift. And when you start thinking of all of the privileges that you have, like, as a gift, it changes the way you look at pressure. And I think part of that is, I do think a lot of that has to do with, having grown up with an extended village, where you don't take everything for granted. You name, a public program, I've been on it. Free lunch, WIC, Medicaid, like, all of those things. Some people, if you, depending on their political background, they would say, oh, well, you didn't earn those things. And I'm like, well, at the end of the day, like, the reason I'm able to take care of all of these kids that come in, no matter their background, whether, socioeconomic, racial, citizenship, is because people poured into me. And so it is almost like part of it is a sense of duty, but it's also a sense of pride, that, even when I'm uncomfortable, I have a very vivid memory of phases where people, who didn't even know me, went out of their way. Actually, I have a story. I remember once I was at Westminster, was supposed to go to Europe, and I didn't have all the funding. They called me out of class, and I thought I was in trouble. And the headmaster, presented me with a check. And, like, to this day, I don't know who wrote it. But somebody saw something in me, and they were like, this kid, I just won, like, the National Latin Exam Award, like a gold, medal or something. And they said, I want to sponsor you. And they weren't allowed to disclose who they were. And so in cumulative, I've, probably had over $1 million in scholarship funds. I also been at a lot of school, so that it racks up. But that's kind of been my story. I've really been, lifted, by the kindness of others. And so a lot of it is reframing. I think the other piece is also my faith. I grew up going to church. My grandmother is saved, sanctified, filled with the Holy Ghost. She's exactly what you would imagine a Southern grandma from Atlanta would be. And she's been praying over me since I was a child, like, to the point where I think my acne was because I got my head anointed with oil so many times. Like, it was literally every exam, every test. She's like, okay, come on, baby, we gotta anoint your head. And so I was just, like, anointed, with, this, olive oil from the kitchen, because she was praying.
Mm-hmm.
And so I grew up knowing that, God could make a way out of no way. And so it never surprised me, when things would just miraculously happen, because, I'm someone who mom hit rock bottom. And then, my mother has been clean for over 20 years. And she is, one of those folks that is thriving. She sells tax software, and she has, like, some of the best rates in the United States. And people have no idea. I'm like, that hustle is born out of, again, necessity. because she was doing what she had to do. And, when you're a kid who, visits their parent in, halfway homes for much of their childhood, and now you see them making six figures because that hustle, you know, was translated once, God saw fit to heal her.
Mm.
Anything is possible. And so that, between, my faith in God and just the way that my family has always told me, to whom much is given, much is to be expected. Like those two things kind of keep me rooted. And even though I may be physically far away, I'm always rooted in that history and that legacy.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that that's a very beautiful thing to have such a strong foundation when it comes to that family dynamic, right? Like many people like could assume where it's just like with the family dynamics that with your parents, it's like, oh, well, maybe she doesn't have the best family dynamics, but that's not necessarily the case. You know, you had your grandmother and your grandfather, you had like cousins and aunts and all those other kind of aspects as well as the people who weren't necessarily family in the sense of they came to all of the family gatherings or they were there for every single birthday, but like they saw something in you, as you said, and was like, this person, they need to make sure that they're there for that journey as far as the angel giver who gave that gift for you to go to that trip in Europe. Like, I think that these are all really beautiful foundations of what a family could look like in your perspective. And so, like, I'm curious around when you got to that point in your life where you decided to choose your own family, right? And like, I guess I'm making a pivot towards your husband. And whenever you decided to make that decision, like, what has that journey been like as far as traveling to all of these different places, like from DC to Seattle to, as we were talking a little bit earlier, moving to Baltimore? Like, how has that been going as far as choosing that life partner who would go into all these other different aspects of your journey with you?
So it's interesting now to reflect on it. I met my husband when I was a baby. So I wasn't even 18 when I started college, and Josh was actually a freshman. And so he likes to say I wasn't even checking on you because I was underage. um, and so I actually met him on a visit, and he was playing like NBA 2K Live, like not even paying me any mind. Just look, I was borrowing like a sleeping bag or something as I came to visit some friends who already went to Georgetown. And so it was also like a very surprising turn of events because my husband's family is like, Asian Pacific Islander. And so, that added a whole nother level of complexity because my family obviously is the family that I know is all African American. And so I don't know, I think college was just a lot about exploration, and I think he is also one of those folks that is truly a partner. Like I mean, my last name is Jinks-Chang. He changed his name for me as well, and so that just kind of embodies like the type of person he is because he knew that my name is carried down from my grandfather, and my name will be the last like Jinx in our side of the family, and it meant a lot to me to carry my grandfather's name after he passed. And so he was like, okay, well, we'll leave your name, first, and I'll adopt it too, so that our children will carry on my grandfather's name.
Mm.
Which is, it's hard because especially in a lot of, Black families where there's, you know, the last name it is often it's like a grandparent who's carrying it, that you're pulling it from. He understood that, not even having come from, a Black family, but he knew what it meant to me. And so I remember discussing, this like fairly early in our relationship because I was like, I'm not changing my name. I'm going to medical school. I work hard for that. And he was like always just supportive. And I mean, that's just one example. But when I decided I wanted to go to medical school, when we were dating, when I was a freshman, I used to say things like that, later on, and a lot of the people didn't believe me. Like I was in a student career experience program through the Pentagon, and so I had a government job lined up for me. Like I was a GS7 by the time I was a junior.
Mm.
And when I was like, oh, I'm going to medical school, like they didn't know Science Camp Samara. They didn't know any of that. They just knew that I went to the Pentagon and I came back, and the language of, briefing books, and I worked in the SecDef's office, and with the press secretary, I had, all of my agendas had action items at the bottom, because that's how the Pentagon briefings were prepared. Everybody just knew I was going into civil service, whether it was, through DOD or politics or something. And then I swerved and said medical school, and nobody believed me except for Josh, because he was like, "Oh no, like she's serious." And so once I got into Duke, we did long distance. So he was in DC, and luckily he's more, tech math oriented. So initially when we did the long distance, I had a feeling that he was going to end up making sacrifices, because his jobs didn't always entail him being in person, which, fast forward to the pandemic, has been, kind of accelerated in a sense. But he's just always been a writer. Like, I don't even know how else to describe him. And I think that is important if you're going to be a female physician, because there are not that many like men that are willing to follow women around the country, in the same way, that women follow men. And, maybe that will change in some generations. But I think he knew, that this was my passion. And that honestly, I feel like my community had poured into me so much that I was like I felt like I was carrying, all of Southwest Atlanta with me every step along the way, when I went to Harvard, when I went to Duke, when I went to Georgetown. And those things were important to him too, because it was bigger than me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think when you have a partner that sees your passion and takes it on as their own, it changes the difficult conversations, about like, oh, I got into, a West Coast program and an East Coast program for medical school. What are we going to do? His answer has always been, what is going to serve you best? Because what is going to serve you best is going to serve us best. So even now, we're going to Hopkins for my fellowship, which is the next phase of training. There's always another phase of training in medicine. And his family is in Maryland. So finally we kind of get to go back, to where his support networks are rooted. And he'll actually be back and forth to Expedia headquarters, here in Seattle. And we're like a modern couple. We're like, okay, there's going to be a little bit of bicoastal. But at the end of the day, we've made it, what is it, like 15 years now of us bouncing around, trying to kind of, do justice to this, this passion, this dream of mine, to become a physician and serve. And so I think, I think between, the just innate like aspects of his character, and also, we're both Christian. I think we kind of speak the same language. Even if we don't come, if you look at us, you wouldn't be like, what, how do they get together? But his family upbringing also had a lot to do with it. His mom is a very strong working mom, and I owe a lot to Mama Chang, as well, because it takes a strong woman to raise a son like that. So I want to make sure I give her some credit for that as well.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, especially like, overall I've been hearing like this kind of theme of like pursuit of excellence. And like, we talked a lot about like family and like their whole important aspect of having like that support of not only just the family that you're born with, but also the family that you choose. That same aspect around like how community can have that same type of support overarchingly. And like, it really sounds like, when it comes to self, like through your entire journey, it sounds like you've been really adamant towards knowing who you are and like knowing what you're aiming for. And so like, I'm kind of curious if you can talk on a little bit as you're going into this next phase of training into your fellowship, like what is that overarching aim that you're trying to do when it comes to serving? Because like, I heard you talk about whenever you were in Ethiopia and like, trying to teach the students English, and you're like, how can I teach these students English whenever like the biggest concern that they have is like their own hunger, and like the impact that had onto you, and like being that kind of advocate within like the medical field and being that kind of provider. Like, what is I guess you could say the disparities that you're aiming for, or the goal that you're trying to accomplish through your acts of service?
So I don't know. I think the word like mission driven kind of always comes to mind whenever I think about what moves I'm going to make. Um, what is going to set me up to have the largest impact. And I think that's part of the reason why I got a public health degree, because I kind of see the world, through this population health lens. Um, and that was from, again, Barbara and Richard. Like my grandfather, he, would travel into the prisons across the state and track STI trends. That was his job. And so when you see that, day in and day out, like he had these legal pads that I'll never forget, these yellow legal pads that he would fill with all of these reports. And I would kind of edit them with little commas and, those type of things. And, he would always make it very clear that, everything that you have, every gift that you have is borrowed from God.
Mm.
All of these borrowed gifts that you have are not yours. We're only here for a finite amount of time. And so I think that, seeing what it looks like to be, mission driven, whether it's taking care of your, grandkids or taking care of, those people that have been literally like thrown away by society. Like that's what I grew up seeing. And so, now part of the reason it's kind of a full circle journey is that my fellowship at Hopkins will be in addiction medicine and adolescent medicine. And so it's a combination of, those issues that a lot of people want to dismiss because it's easy to blame, people and not systems. I never had the luxury of doing that. Because if, people who have made mistakes, got to be deleted, like I wouldn't have any family left because we all make mistakes. And I think for me, giving people grace means, looking beyond just, one decision. So adolescent medicine, which is not as familiar to a lot of folks, kind of encompasses, reproductive health, gender care, things, there's to a certain aspect like incarcerated youth, so juvenile justice issues, anything that's kind of unique to teens, eating disorders. And so I think the reason I flock to, the addiction medicine piece is probably more obvious, but for adolescent, we are very prone in this country to, basically judge someone based on, one of the worst decisions that they've ever made. So the kids that I work with now, as an attending, I work at a juvenile detention center for kids who committed felony crimes. And society has said that, the mistakes that they've made, merit, removal. It's like, we got to figure this out, but it's not too late. The way that it's done, at Echo Glen, like we have, canine training teams and golf clinics, like it's really meant to be rehabilitation and not punishment. And I almost wish, if I were an adult doctor, I could carry the same level of understanding that we have for young people that are still figuring out, how to navigate their lives later on. But that's not really how we function. It's like, to me, adolescence is like that last phase where people still haven't given up on you. And again, my life has been, one phase after the other, people stepping in and saying, oh, like, you are worthy, you are enough, you deserve this. And not everybody gets that. I mean, a lot of my siblings, ended up having, my nieces and nephews fairly young. And I think having seen that up front, I feel like I'm, uniquely positioned to kind of advocate for people who wouldn't otherwise have an advocate. So I kind of try to put myself in places and spaces where my story, whether I tell it out loud or not, because most of my patients don't necessarily know my background, where I can be that, the person stepping in and kind of advocating in a way that others have done for me.
Yeah, no, that's really beautiful. I really, this entire time I've been listening to you and like talk about how you've been reframing as far as like that coping mechanism, as far as like this whole concept of having a gift and like we're only, like you said, we're only on this earth for a finite time. So why not just share that gift that we have? Because, to hold it to yourself is kind of selfishly. And like at the same time, like if you don't share that gift, then it's just like wasted potential, for lack of a better term. And like I think it's just really beautiful around how you your perspective on life, and like how you go about, and even just always coming out with the strongest energy that you possibly can when it comes to whether it's your personal life, your professional life, or anything. Like it's really and truthfully admirable, and I just want to just thank you for just sharing your perspective on that today.
Yeah, I mean, I can't phrase it like, it's hard for me to put into words just really like those seeds that were planted, which is again why I was attracted to working with young people.
Mm,
Because if you plant seeds in a child early enough, you know, they're indestructible. Like I genuinely think, that the village that brought me here, like they will never, they're irreplaceable. And this is part of the reason why whenever people have, nuclear families, I was never fully jealous, because I was like, oh well, you have one mom, I have like five. I have my auntie who grew up with me, was in my house along with my uncle. We never had less than 8 people in my house at any given point in time.
mhm.
And so for some people, they're like, oh, that sounds like chaotic. And I'm like, well, when you're a kid, it just sounds fun.
Yeah.
Right? Like I can, steal people's shoes, play dress up. Like kids are so resilient. You put them in any situation and, they will make do. I see it in the hospital all the time. I see kids in our cancer unit with NG tubes taking dance breaks on their bed. Kids who can't even swallow and eat, but will find joy in, really small moments. I'm just so grateful to them. I think that's the other thing that has kept me going, because I get to work with children who remind me every day that every second, every moment, every minute, every hour is a gift, because their lives may be shorter than even mine, which doesn't seem, fair, in the grand scheme of things. So you just have to, live every moment as you can, and write things down. That's another thing that I learned. During COVID, it's just, there's been a lot of time for reflection. And I think, our family in particular, I always say that I'm in constant contact with them. We have these family prayer calls every Sunday that started during the pandemic. And I've been the recorder. So I've written down all of our prayer requests and all of our praise reports from the beginning. So I have 2 years worth now.
Mm,
And because there's so many of my, siblings and aunts and, my mom and grandma, like there's generally, no less than, like I said, like 8 or so people. And I almost feel like the historian for the family.
yeah.
Um, this is all on iPhone notes, so you can't really, it's not like written or anything. But one day I really plan to compile them, because every once in a while I'll look back and I'll say, oh, well, back in, April of 2020, like this was what was going on. And certain, dreams have been manifested in that time. So like you started by asking, how was this last week? My sister, Raina, just graduated from Miami. And, they said, oh, you get 5 tickets. We rolled up with like 20 people. That's just how we are.
Yeah.
We got there 2 hours early. Mr. Randy helped us get, finesse the situation. And so it was a beautiful thing, because not every one of my siblings has had such the same route that I've had. And so, all of the nieces and nephews there, 2 of my other sisters, who came before Raina, were there with all of their kids. And, everybody's in tears, right? Because this means so much to our family in a way that, none of the other families necessarily knew. But we had chance. And, I feel like when you're from, a marginalized community, we take nothing for granted.
Hmm.
Um, every step across that stage, my grandmother, she was sitting there crying just like the rest of us, because she couldn't even go to a predominantly white institution. My mother went to Spelman, my godmother went to Spelman, everybody went to HBCU. So she's very quick to remind us that we are, standing on the shoulders of everyone who went, before us, herself included. And so I think pausing for reflection and, writing things down and having, especially when elders say it, when she says something good, I pull up my notes immediately and write it down, because who knows, how long we're gonna have her. So I'm not the type of person to do a journal per se, but I definitely like do like little quick notes. And I feel like medicine got me into doing that too, because you have these documentation needs, and I'm recording people's stories every day. Like whenever I get bogged down by charting, I'm like, you know what? I'm recording a part of this person's life, and they're going through something, and I'm kind of the historian for that experience for them in a way.
Yeah.
And so that's another, I think that COVID has taught me that.
Man, I really appreciate this time that I've had with you today. You've always been a really great friend, and though we don't always get a chance to talk as much as I would like I always enjoy the times that I do get to chat with you. You always fill my cup, and I just want to tell you that I appreciate you, and I appreciate your time today. But before I let you go, there are some lightning questions that I like to do on every episode, and so we'll go through those, and then I'll let you get on to the rest of your day. How's that sound?
Sure.
All right. What's your favorite relaxation or self-care activity?
I would have to say dance. There's nothing like just kind of having some music on that you love and just, going crazy. That's kind of my release.
Nice. I love it. Best book recommendation?
So I am reading a book right now that one of my residents actually recommended, called Not in My Backyard, on the history of Baltimore and like redlining and segregation. And so I kind of feel like if I'm going to move to a place, I need to know the history of the place. So that book has been really eye-opening for me.
Yeah. Okay. I love that. And one person that you want to thank for your journey thus far?
Well, I mean, I have to say Barbara, because I know she's going to listen to this, and all of the Sword of the Lord Church is probably going to hear about it. But yeah, my grandmother, that's my heart. And anybody who knows me has heard about her, just because she's the reason I'm here. And I'm so grateful to her for that.
Yeah, well, that sounds great. Well, Samara, like as always, I really appreciate your time, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Same to you.
This has been another episode of Don't Be Coy with Uncle Lew. As always, I'd like to thank this episode's guest for a great conversation, as well as thank you, the listener, for joining in. Whether you're a first-time listener or a regular, I always appreciate your support. If you like today's episode and ever want to listen to more, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Audible, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. And to join our community and access future bonus content, be sure to visit dbkpodcast.com.